It was a quiet afternoon in a small town surrounded by dense woods. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. A teenage boy, around 16 years old, was walking home from school. He was an ordinary kid with a kind heart and a curious mind. He loved exploring nature and often took the longer route home just to enjoy the peacefulness of the woods. As he walked along the trail, he noticed something unusual. A little girl, no older than 6, was standing near the edge of the woods. She looked scared and confused, clutching a small teddy bear in her arms. The boy stopped in his tracks, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. He glanced around but didn't see any adults nearby. The girl was alone. Before he could approach her, a man emerged from the trees. He was tall and wore a dark hoodie, his face partially hidden. The man grabbed the girl's hand and started pulling her toward the woods. The boy's heart raced. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it didn't look good. The girl looked back at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't scream or cry. It was as if she was too scared to make a sound. The boy hesitated for a moment. Should he intervene? What if he was misunderstanding the situation? But something deep inside told him he had to act. He couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, he decided to follow them quietly, keeping a safe distance. He didn't want to alert the man but needed to make sure the girl was safe. The woods grew thicker as they moved deeper, and the boy struggled to keep up without making noise. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why was he taking the girl into the woods? And where were her parents? He thought about calling the police, but he didn't have his phone with him. He had left it at home that morning, thinking he wouldn't need it. As he followed, he noticed the man glancing over his shoulder occasionally, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. The boy ducked behind trees and bushes, careful not to be seen. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were sweaty, but he kept going. He couldn't let the girl disappear into the woods without knowing she was safe. After what felt like an eternity, the man and the girl stopped near a small clearing. The boy crouched behind a tree, peeking out to see what was happening. The man knelt down and started talking to the girl in a low voice. The boy couldn't hear what he was saying, but the girl nodded slowly, still clutching her teddy bear. She looked terrified. The boy knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand by and watch. But what could he do? He was just a kid himself, and the man was much bigger and stronger. He thought about yelling for help, but they were too deep in the woods. No one would hear him. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. As he watched, the man stood up and started walking further into the woods, pulling the girl along with him. The boy realized this might be his only chance to act. He looked around for something he could use, a stick, a rock, anything. His eyes landed on a thick branch lying on the ground. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He picked up the branch and took a deep breath. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to move. He stepped out from behind the tree and called out, "Hey! Leave her alone." His voice shook, but it was loud enough to startle the man. The man turned around, his eyes narrowing as he saw the boy standing there with the branch in his hand. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man smirked and said, "This doesn't concern you, kid. Walk away." The boy tightened his grip on the branch. "Let her go," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. The girl looked at him with hope in her eyes, but she still didn't say a word. The man took a step toward the boy, his expression darkening. "You don't want to do this," he said in a low, threatening voice. But the boy stood his ground. He couldn't back down now. What happened next would change everything. The boy knew he was in over his head, but he also knew he couldn't let the girl be taken. He had to be brave, even if it meant putting himself in danger. The man took another step forward, and the boy raised the branch, ready to defend himself and the girl. The tension in the air was palpable. The boy's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of this situation. He knew he couldn't fight the man head-on, but he had to buy some time. Maybe someone would hear the commotion and come to help. Or maybe he could distract the man long enough for the girl to run. As the man lunged toward him, the boy swung the branch with all his might. The man dodged it easily and grabbed the branch, yanking it out of the boy's hands. The boy stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He was out of options now. But just as the man raised the branch to strike, a loud noise echoed through the woods. The boy turned his head to see a group of hikers approaching the clearing. They had heard the commotion and were coming to investigate. The man froze, his eyes darting toward the newcomers. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to fight, but then he dropped the branch and took off running into the woods, leaving the girl behind. The boy rushed to the girl's side, his hands trembling as he checked to make sure she was okay. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes and finally spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The hikers reached them a moment later, asking what had happened. The boy explained everything as best as he could, still shaken by the ordeal. One of the hikers called the police, and within minutes, the woods were filled with the sound of sirens. The boy stayed with the girl until the police arrived. He answered their questions and gave them a description of the man. The girl was reunited with her parents, who had been frantically searching for her. They hugged her tightly, tears streaming down their faces, and thanked the boy for his bravery. As the boy walked home that evening, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was relieved that the girl was safe, but he was also haunted by what had happened. He kept replaying the events in his mind, wondering if he could have done anything differently. But deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself, and that was what mattered. The boy didn't think of himself as a hero, but to the little girl and her family, he was nothing less. The days that followed the incident in the woods were a whirlwind for the boy. News of what had happened spread quickly through the small town. People he didn't even know stopped him on the street to shake his hand or pat him on the back. "You're a hero," they said, their voices filled with admiration. But the boy didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like he'd done what anyone would have done in that situation, or at least, what they should have done. The police had launched a full-scale search for the man in the hoodie, but so far, they hadn't found him. The boy had given them as much detail as he could remember, the man's height, his build, the way he'd spoken, but it wasn't much to go on. The woods were vast, and the man could have gone in any direction. The boy couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, somewhere, watching and waiting. The little girl's parents had invited the boy over for dinner to thank him properly. He'd been nervous about going, unsure of what to say or how to act, but they'd been so kind and welcoming that he'd quickly felt at ease. The girl, whose name he learned was Mia, had clung to her mother's side at first, but by the end of the evening, she'd warmed up to him. She'd even shown him her collection of stuffed animals, including the teddy bear she'd been holding that day in the woods. "You saved my best friend," she'd said, holding up the bear. "Thank you." The boy had smiled, but inside, he'd felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd come to doing nothing. What if he'd hesitated a moment longer? What if he'd convinced himself it wasn't his problem? The thought made him sick to his stomach. As the days turned into weeks, life slowly returned to normal, or at least, as normal as it could be. The boy went back to school, back to his routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He found himself looking over his shoulder more often, scanning the faces of strangers when he walked down the street. He started taking a different route home, avoiding the woods altogether. He told himself it was just a precaution, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was scared. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he noticed a car parked at the edge of the woods. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The boy slowed his pace, his heart starting to race. There was something about the car that felt off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He told himself he was being paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he passed the car, he glanced inside. The windows were tinted, but he thought he saw movement in the driver's seat. His stomach churned, and he quickened his pace, keeping his eyes straight ahead. He didn't look back until he was safely inside his house, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment he'd seen the car, wondering if he'd imagined the movement in the window. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That he'd seen a suspicious car? It wasn't exactly a crime. Still, the feeling of unease stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The next day, he decided to take a different route home again, one that took him through the center of town instead of past the woods. It was a longer walk, but it felt safer. As he walked, he tried to distract himself by thinking about other things, school, his friends, the upcoming weekend, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the car. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the man in the woods, even though he had no proof. When he got home, his mom was in the kitchen, making dinner. She smiled when she saw him, but her expression quickly turned to concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You look pale." The boy hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. He didn't want to worry her, but he also didn't want to keep everything bottled up. "I'm fine," he said finally. "Just tired." His mom studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." The boy forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about what his mom had said, about how she was there if he needed to talk. He knew she meant well, but he didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. How could he put into words the fear that had taken root in his chest, the sense that something bad was going to happen? As he drifted off to sleep, his mind wandered back to the woods. He dreamed of the man in the hoodie, of the way he'd smirked when he told the boy to walk away. He dreamed of the little girl, her eyes wide with fear, clutching her teddy bear. And he dreamed of the car, its tinted windows hiding something, or someone, inside. When he woke up the next morning, he felt more tired than he had when he'd gone to bed. He dragged himself out of bed and got ready for school, his mind still clouded with thoughts of the woods and the man and the car. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he needed to stop letting his imagination run wild. But as he walked to school, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At school, he tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept wandering. His friends noticed that something was off and asked if he was okay. He brushed them off, saying he was just tired, but he could tell they didn't believe him. He didn't blame them. He wouldn't have believed himself either. After school, he decided to take the long way home again. As he walked through the center of town, he noticed a group of kids gathered around a bulletin board outside the library. Curious, he walked over to see what they were looking at. There, pinned to the board, was a flyer with a picture of the man in the hoodie. The words, "Wanted," were printed in bold letters across the top, along with a description of the man and a phone number to call with any information. The boy's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the flyer, his mind racing. The man was still out there, and the police were looking for him. He thought about the car he'd seen the day before, about the movement he'd noticed in the window. Could it have been the man? Was he still in town, watching and waiting? The boy didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to call the police and tell them about the car, but another part of him was scared. What if he was wrong? What if he was just being paranoid? He didn't want to waste their time, but he also didn't want to take any chances. As he stood there, staring at the flyer, he made a decision. He would keep his eyes open, stay alert, and if he saw anything suspicious, he would call the police. He didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but it was the only thing he could think of. The boy walked home, his mind still racing. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let his guard down. Not again. The boy's unease grew as the days passed. The image of the man in the hoodie in the mysterious car lingered in his mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. He found himself scanning the streets more carefully, paying attention to every unfamiliar face and every parked car. His friends noticed his distraction and tried to cheer him up, but their jokes and laughter felt distant, like they were happening to someone else. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he decided to take a detour past the police station. He didn't know why. Maybe he just wanted to feel closer to the investigation, or maybe he was hoping to see some sign that the man had been caught. As he approached the station, he noticed a group of officers standing outside, talking in low voices. One of them glanced in his direction and gave him a nod of recognition. It was the officer who had interviewed him after the incident in the woods. The boy hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Hey," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Any news about the man?" The officer shook his head. "Not yet. We're still looking, though. We've got a few leads, but nothing solid." He studied the boy for a moment, his expression softening. "How are you holding up?" The boy shrugged. "I'm okay, I guess. Just worried." The officer nodded. "That's understandable. What you did was brave, but it's normal to feel shaken up after something like that. If you ever need to talk, or if you remember anything else, don't hesitate to call us." The boy nodded, but he didn't say anything about the car he'd seen. He still wasn't sure if it meant anything, and he didn't want to sound like he was overreacting. Instead, he thanked the officer and continued on his way. As he walked, he thought about what the officer had said. Brave. The word didn't sit right with him. He didn't feel brave. He felt scared, scared of the man, scared of the woods, scared of what might happen next. But he also felt determined. He wasn't going to let fear control him. He had to stay alert, stay focused. If the man was still out there, he needed to be ready. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table doing homework, his mom walked in and set a plate of cookies in front of him. "Thought you could use a snack," she said with a smile. The boy looked up, surprised. "Thanks, Mom." She sat down across from him, studying his face. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" The boy hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, about the car, about the flyer, about the fear that wouldn't go away, but he didn't want to worry her. "I'm fine," he said finally. "Just a lot on my mind." His mom nodded, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." "I know," he said, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Mom." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, you know. What you did for that little girl, it was incredible." The boy looked down at his homework, his cheeks burning. He didn't know how to respond. He didn't feel incredible. He just felt tired. The next day at school, the boy's teacher announced that the class would be going on a field trip to the local nature reserve. The reserve was on the outskirts of town, near the woods where the incident had happened. The boy's stomach churned at the thought, but he didn't say anything. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. When the day of the field trip arrived, the boy tried to push his worries aside. He told himself that the reserve was a safe place, that there would be plenty of adults around, and that nothing bad would happen. But as the bus pulled up to the reserve, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The class spent the morning exploring the trails, learning about the local plants and wildlife. The boy tried to focus on the tour guide's words, but his mind kept wandering. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. His friends noticed his distraction and teased him about it, but their jokes fell flat. After lunch, the class was given some free time to explore the reserve on their own. The boy stayed close to the group, not wanting to wander too far. As he walked, he noticed a small path leading off the main trail. It was overgrown and barely visible, but something about it caught his attention. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow it. The path led deeper into the woods, away from the reserve. The boy's heart raced as he walked, but he couldn't explain why. He told himself he was just being curious, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He felt like he was being pulled forward, like something, or someone, was calling to him. After a few minutes, the path opened up into a small clearing. The boy stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the middle of the clearing, was the car he'd seen the other day, the old, beat-up sedan with the tinted windows. His heart pounded as he stared at the car. What was it doing here? Was the man inside? He took a step closer, his hands trembling. He didn't know what to do. Should he call for help? Should he run? Before he could decide, he heard a rustling sound behind him. He spun around, his heart racing. Standing there, just a few feet away, was the man in the hoodie. His face was partially hidden, but the boy recognized him immediately. The man smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "You just can't stay away, can you?" the man said, his voice low and menacing. The boy's mind raced. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. He thought about screaming for help, but his voice caught in his throat. He was alone, and the man was blocking the only way out. The man took a step closer, and the boy stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He looked around desperately for something, anything, he could use to defend himself. His eyes landed on a large rock a few feet away. He lunged for it, but the man was faster. He grabbed the boy by the arm and yanked him back, his grip like iron. "You should have minded your own business," the man growled, his face inches from the boy's. "Now you're going to regret it." The boy struggled to break free, but the man's grip was too strong. He felt a surge of panic as he realized how much trouble he was in. He had to think fast. He couldn't let the man take him. Summoning all his strength, the boy kicked the man in the shin as hard as he could. The man grunted in pain and loosened his grip just enough for the boy to wrench his arm free. He didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. The man shouted something behind him, but the boy didn't look back. He ran as fast as he could, his legs burning with effort. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get away. He could hear the man chasing him, his footsteps pounding against the ground. The boy's mind raced as he ran. He thought about the little girl, about how scared she'd been that day in the woods. He thought about his mom, about how worried she'd be if he didn't come home. He thought about the officer, about how he'd told him to stay alert. He couldn't let the man catch him. He just couldn't. As he ran, he spotted the main trail up ahead. If he could just reach it, he might be able to find help. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning. The man was close behind him, but the boy didn't dare look back. He focused everything he had on reaching the trail. Just as he burst out of the woods and onto the trail, he collided with someone. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, and looked up to see his teacher staring at him in shock. "What's going on?" the teacher asked, her voice filled with concern. The boy opened his mouth to explain, but before he could say anything, the man emerged from the woods. He froze when he saw the teacher, his eyes darting between her and the boy. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man turned and disappeared back into the trees. The boy's legs gave out, and he sank to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His teacher knelt beside him, her face pale. "Are you okay? What happened?" The boy shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know how to explain what had just happened. All he knew was that he'd been lucky, this time. The boy sat on the ground, trembling, as his teacher tried to calm him down. Other students and chaperones began to gather around, their faces filled with concern. The boy's mind was still racing, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the questions being thrown at him. What happened? Are you hurt? Who was that man? The boy tried to speak, but his voice came out in a shaky whisper. It was him, the man from the woods. He's here. The teacher's eyes widened in alarm. She immediately pulled out her phone and called the police, explaining the situation in a hurried, urgent tone. The boy could hear the crackle of the dispatcher's voice on the other end, but he couldn't make out the words. His mind was still stuck on the man's face, the way he'd smirked, the way he'd grabbed him. He felt like he was going to be sick. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. The boy was still sitting on the ground, his arms wrapped around his knees, when an officer approached him. It was the same officer he'd spoken to outside the police station a few days earlier. "Hey, kid," the officer said gently, crouching down to his level. "Can you tell me what happened?" The boy took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He explained everything, how he'd followed the path, how he'd found the car, how the man had appeared out of nowhere and grabbed him. The officer listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each word. "You're sure it was the same man?" the officer asked. The boy nodded. "I'm sure. It was him." The officer stood up and turned to his colleagues, barking out orders. "We need to search the area. He can't have gone far. And someone check that car, see if it's registered to him." The boy watched as the officers spread out, their radios crackling with updates. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see his teacher standing over him, her face filled with concern. "Let's get you back to the group," she said softly. "You've been through enough." The boy nodded and let her help him to his feet. His legs were still shaky, but he managed to walk back to the main area of the reserve where the rest of the class was gathered. His friends crowded around him, asking questions, but he didn't have the energy to answer. He just wanted to go home. The police kept the class at the reserve for another hour while they searched the area. They didn't find the man, but they did find the car. It was abandoned, the keys still in the ignition. The officers ran the plates and discovered that the car had been reported stolen a week earlier. The boy felt a chill run down his spine. The man was still out there, and he was getting more desperate. When the police finally gave the all-clear, the class boarded the bus to head back to school. His friend hesitated for a moment, then said, "You know, if you ever want to talk. I'm here." The boy nodded, but he didn't say anything. He didn't know how to put his feelings into words. He didn't even know what he was feeling. All he knew was that he was tired of being scared, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of feeling like he was trapped in a nightmare. After school, the boy decided to take a different route home. He didn't want to risk running into the man again, even though he knew the police were still searching for him. As he walked, he noticed a flyer taped to a lamppost. It was the same wanted flyer he'd seen before, with the man's picture and description. He stopped and stared at it, his heart pounding. The man was still out there, and he was dangerous. The boy knew he had to be careful, but he also knew he couldn't live in fear forever. He had to find a way to move forward, to reclaim his life. As he stood there, staring at the flyer, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let the man control him anymore. He was going to be brave, not just for himself, but for Mia, for his mom, for everyone who cared about him. He took a deep breath and continued walking, his steps a little firmer than before. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let the man win. The boy's resolve to stay strong wavered over the next few days. Despite his determination, the fear lingered, creeping into his thoughts when he least expected it. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. He found himself jumping at the slightest noise, his heart racing at the sight of anyone who even remotely resembled the man in the hoodie. The town felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the man's presence loomed over everything. The police continued their search, but there were no new leads. The stolen car had been impounded, but it yielded no useful clues. The man had vanished again, leaving behind only questions and unease. The boy tried to focus on school and his friends, but his mind kept drifting back to the woods, to the clearing, to the man's menacing smirk. One evening, as the boy was helping his mom with dinner, the doorbell rang. He froze, his hands clutching a stack of plates. His mom gave him a reassuring smile and went to answer the door. It was the officer he'd spoken to before, along with another detective. They asked if they could come in and talk. The boy's mom invited them inside, and they all sat down in the living room. The officer explained that they were following up on the case and wanted to ask the boy a few more questions. The boy nodded, his stomach twisting into knots. "We've been looking into the man's background," the detective said, flipping through a notebook. "We think he might have a connection to this area. Do you remember anything else about him? Anything at all that might help us?" The boy thought hard, trying to recall every detail. "He was tall," he said slowly. "And he had a deep voice. He was wearing a dark hoodie, but I couldn't see his face very well. He seemed like he knew the woods. Like he'd been there before." The detective nodded, jotting down notes. "Anything else? Did he say anything that stood out?" The boy hesitated. "He told me to mind my own business. And he said I'd regret it." The detective's expression darkened. "This man is dangerous. We're doing everything we can to find him, but we need your help. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, let us know immediately." The boy nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wanted to help, but he didn't know what else he could say. He'd already told them everything he could remember. After the officers left, the boy's mom sat down next to him and put an arm around his shoulders. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. "I know it's hard, but you're helping them catch him." The boy leaned into her, feeling a small sense of comfort. "I just want it to be over," he whispered. "I know," his mom said, hugging him tightly. "Me too." The next day at school, the boy's teacher pulled him aside during lunch. "I just wanted to check in with you," she said, her voice gentle. "How are you holding up?" The boy shrugged. "I'm okay, I guess. Just tired." His teacher nodded sympathetically. "I can't imagine what you're going through. But if you ever need to talk, or if you need a break from class, just let me know." The boy thanked her, but he didn't say much else. He didn't know how to explain how he was feeling. He didn't even understand it himself. After school, the boy decided to stop by the library. He needed a distraction, something to take his mind off everything that had happened. As he browsed the shelves, he noticed a book about survival skills. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, his interest piqued. Maybe if he learned how to protect himself, he wouldn't feel so scared all the time. He checked out the book and took it home, reading it cover to cover that night. The book was filled with tips on how to stay safe in dangerous situations, how to defend yourself, and how to stay calm under pressure. The boy felt a small spark of hope as he read. Maybe he didn't have to feel helpless. Maybe he could learn to take control. Over the next few days, the boy practiced some of the techniques he'd read about. He learned how to stay aware of his surroundings, how to use everyday objects as weapons, and how to stay calm in a crisis. He didn't know if he'd ever need to use these skills, but just knowing he had them made him feel a little stronger. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he noticed a group of kids gathered near the park. They were laughing and playing, their voices carrying on the wind. The boy stopped and watched them for a moment, feeling a pang of longing. He missed feeling carefree, like nothing in the world could hurt him. As he stood there, he noticed a man sitting on a bench nearby. The man was wearing a hoodie, and his face was partially hidden. The boy's heart skipped a beat. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that not every man in a hoodie was the one he was afraid of. But he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of what he'd learned. Stay aware. Stay calm. Don't let fear control you. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the man. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't the same person. The man on the bench was older, his face kind and weathered. He gave the boy a friendly nod as he passed. The boy let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He felt a small sense of relief, but also a pang of frustration. He hated feeling like this, like every little thing was a threat. He wanted to feel normal again. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the book he'd read. He thought about the techniques he'd learned, and how they'd made him feel a little more in control. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he could change how he responded to it. He could choose to be brave, even when he was scared. The next morning, the boy woke up feeling a little more determined. He wasn't going to let the man's shadow hang over him anymore. He was going to take back his life, one step at a time. As he walked to school, he noticed the wanted flyers still posted around town. He stopped and stared at one for a moment, his jaw tightening. The man was still out there, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He was going to keep moving forward, no matter what. When he got to school, he noticed Mia standing by the entrance. She smiled when she saw him and ran over, her teddy bear clutched in her arms. "Hi," she said brightly. "I wanted to say thank you again. You're my hero." The boy felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't feel like a hero, but hearing her say it made him feel a little stronger. "You're welcome," he said softly. "I'm just glad you're okay." Mia nodded, her smile fading a little. "I'm still scared sometimes. But my mom says it's okay to be scared, as long as you don't let it stop you." The boy felt a surge of emotion. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Mia gave him a quick hug before running off to join her friends. As he watched her go, the boy felt a small spark of hope. Maybe he didn't have to face his fears alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. The boy's newfound determination carried him through the next few days. He focused on school, spent time with his friends, and even started feeling a little more like his old self. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it didn't control him as much as it used to. He was learning to live with it, to push through it. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he noticed a commotion near the town square. A small crowd had gathered, and people were talking in hushed, urgent tones. Curious, the boy walked over to see what was going on. As he got closer, he saw a police officer standing on the steps of the town hall, addressing the crowd. "We're asking everyone to remain vigilant," the officer said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "We believe the suspect may still be in the area. If you see anything suspicious, please report it immediately." The boy's heart sank. The man was still out there, and the police still hadn't caught him. He felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in his stomach, but he pushed it down. He couldn't let it take over again. As he turned to leave, he noticed Mia and her mom standing nearby. Mia was clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide with fear. Her mom had a protective arm around her shoulders, but she looked just as scared. The boy hesitated for a moment, then walked over to them. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you guys okay?" Mia's mom gave him a tired smile. "We're just worried. It's hard not to be." The boy nodded. "I know. But the police are doing everything they can. We just have to stay alert. Mia looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust. You'll keep us safe, right? The boy felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know how to answer that. He wasn't sure he could keep anyone safe, least of all himself. But he couldn't let her down. I'll do my best, he said finally. Mia smiled, and her mom gave him a grateful look. Thank you, she said. You've already done so much. The boy nodded, feeling a small sense of pride. He didn't feel like a hero, but he was glad he could help in some small way. As he walked home, he thought about what Mia had said. You'll keep us safe, right? He didn't know if he could, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't let the man win. He couldn't let fear control him, or anyone else. That night, the boy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the man, about the woods, about everything that had happened. He thought about Mia and her mom, about how scared they were. He thought about his own mom, about how much she'd done to protect him. He didn't want to let any of them down. The next morning, the boy woke up feeling more determined than ever. He wasn't going to let the man's shadow hang over him anymore. He was going to take back his life, one step at a time. As he walked to school, he noticed a group of kids gathered near the park. They were laughing and playing, their voices carrying on the wind. The boy stopped and watched them for a moment, feeling a pang of longing. He missed feeling carefree, like nothing in the world could hurt him. As he stood there, he noticed a man sitting on a bench nearby. The man was wearing a hoodie, and his face was partially hidden. The boy's heart skipped a beat. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that not every man in a hoodie was the one he was afraid of. But he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of what he'd learned. Stay aware. Stay calm. Don't let fear control you. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the man. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't the same person. The man on the bench was older, his face kind and weathered. He gave the boy a friendly nod as he passed. The boy let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He felt a small sense of relief, but also a pang of frustration. He hated feeling like this, like every little thing was a threat. He wanted to feel normal again. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the book he'd read. He thought about the techniques he'd learned, and how they'd made him feel a little more in control. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he could change how he responded to it. He could choose to be brave, even when he was scared. The next morning, the boy woke up feeling a little more determined. He wasn't going to let the man's shadow hang over him anymore. He was going to take back his life, one step at a time. As he walked to school, he noticed the wanted flyers still posted around town. He stopped and stared at one for a moment, his jaw tightening. The man was still out there, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He was going to keep moving forward, no matter what. When he got to school, he noticed Mia standing by the entrance. She smiled when she saw him and ran over, her teddy bear clutched in her arms. "Hi," she said brightly. "I wanted to say thank you again. You're my hero." The boy felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't feel like a hero, but hearing her say it made him feel a little stronger. "You're welcome," he said softly. "I'm just glad you're okay." Mia nodded, her smile fading a little. "I'm still scared sometimes. But my mom says it's okay to be scared, as long as you don't let it stop you." The boy felt a surge of emotion. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Mia gave him a quick hug before running off to join her friends. As he watched her go, the boy felt a small spark of hope. Maybe he didn't have to face his fears alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward.